A really important part for any game is player input. So let's talk about that. To capture any kind of input in Godot, there are two steps. Number one, we have to create an input map. Basically, what this one is doing is it allows you to capture different kinds of inputs and store them under a certain keyword. For example, we could get the left key on the keyboard and the A key and store them both under the left keyword inside of the input map. That way we can access both of these keys inside of the game very easily. We could also account for the mouse, joysticks, controllers, basically anything. Once we have all of that, we have to access the input. For that, Godot has an input object, and this is allowing us to capture various kinds of inputs. All combined, this should be quite easy to implement. Once again, here is the project we have created so far. And I want to get started by creating an input map. For that, we have to go to the top. There is project, and there we have project settings. If you look at the top, there we have an input map. And right now it's completely empty. For that, we have to create a new action first of all. This would be a category that can capture different kinds of inputs. For example, the one we could start with is left. Now we have one action called left. And this action should have a couple of keys associated. For that, I want to go all the way to the right. There's a plus symbol, and there I can add an event. And here we have keyboard keys, mouse buttons, joypad buttons, and joypad axis. Basically any kind of input. Now, the list for all of them gets quite long because, well, there are a lot of keys on the keyboard. So most of the time, you don't go through the list. Instead you click on listening for input, and then you press the button on the keyboard that you want. So in my case, I want to have the left button, so I click left. And that way, we find the key automatically. Then I can click on OK, and now we have the left physical button. This is the left key on the keyboard. We can also add a second key to this action, which I do again by clicking on plus, and the other key I want to add is the A button. So I just click on A and click on OK. With that, we have left and A, and they both represent left inside of the game. We are going to add quite a few more actions later on, but for now I want to keep it simple. So let's close the input map and see how we can use it. Which is bringing us to the second step. We have to access the input map, and this is going to happen with code. So let's say inside of the level, I want to open the code and make some updates to all of this. The code we are going to write has to be inside of the process function, because this one is going to run on every single frame of the game. If we try to run the code for the input in the ready function, it wouldn't work, because ready is only running for one frame when the game is starting. After that, it wouldn't do anything, so checking input in there would be pointless. Which means inside of process, I'm going to add a few more lines, and the most important line is going to be input. And you can see Godot is coloring this one already, which means this is a special keyword. To understand what it's doing, I think the best way to start this is to look at the documentation. And for that, Godot is amazing, because if you hold Control or Command and you click on Input, then Godot is opening the inbuilt documentation. And in there, you can read anything that you could possibly need about the input object. There's quite a bit, so let me extend the entire thing. And there are all of the methods that you have on the input object. A really easy one, if I scroll down a bit, is action pressed? This one is simply checking if a certain action has been triggered or pressed on the keyboard. Let's use this one. For that, I'm going to stop using this in full screen mode and go back to the level. On input, I want to run a method. So I add dot and then action. There we can choose just pressed, just released, or simply pressed. I want to go with action pressed. And now we can look for the various actions. Godot has a couple of predefined ones, although all the way at the top, we have the one that we created, which is called left. And now, whenever we are pressing the button, or rather whenever the player is pressing the button, this is going to return a boolean that says either true or false. True if the button is pressed, and false if it isn't pressed. Which means we can simply print all of this, and we should see either true or false. Let me run the code, and now I get false because the key isn't pressed, but if I click on the left key or on A, we're getting true, which means we can register for the key press. Cool, this one is working really well. In case you are wondering, if I return to input and look at the method we have just used, there we go, is action pressed. What's the difference between is action pressed and is action just pressed? For that, you can simply click on the method and then you get the entry inside of the documentation. The difference basically is that is action just pressed is only checking the action of pressing the button, which means if the player is pressing a button and holding the button down, we are only getting true once. Whereas is action pressed, we are checking the button being pressed down. So if the player holds down the button, we keep on getting some kind of output. The difference is somewhat subtle, but it can be quite important. If you play around with this, it should become fairly straightforward. And with that, we have the basics of keyboard input. All we have to do now is to expand all of this, and then we can move the player, at least in a very rudimentary sense. First of all, inside of project settings, I want to keep on working inside of the input map. First of all, I want to add a few new actions. Besides left, I also want to have right, I want to have up, and I want to have down. This is going to cover the keys to move the player. On top of that, I want to have a primary action. This would be the left mouse button or the spacebar to shoot a laser later on, although there's still quite a bit of ground to cover before we reach that stage. But first of all, we have to add a few keys to all of these actions. And I would recommend that you are doing this yourself, but I'm going to add a proper exercise later. Although this shouldn't be too hard, so let's just go through it. For the right action, I want to press right on the keyboard, or I want to press D on the keyboard. Next up, for up, I want to press up on the keyboard, click on OK, or I want to press W on the keyboard and click OK. For down, I want to press down on the keyboard and I want to press S on the keyboard. With that, we can move around. Next up, we need primary action. This one is triggered either by the spacebar. This one is easy to capture. All I have to do is press space and there we go. We have the spacebar. Capturing the mouse buttons is a tiny bit more difficult because I couldn't just click in there. Oh well, I actually can, but I didn't know I could do that. So instead of doing that, you could simply look at mouse buttons, and there's left mouse button, right mouse button, middle mouse button, and so on. I want to get the left mouse button. So I click on OK, and there we go. Now we have a ton of keys that we can work with. Now back in the code, let me move back to the editor. I don't want to move this sprite that we have created earlier. Instead, I want to move the player. And for that, I want to clean things up a bit. I don't need the laser image anymore, so I'm going to get rid of this. And this sprite 2D for the grenade, we can also get rid of. That way, we are left only with the player image. On top of that, inside of the level, I want to attach an instance of this player. So with level selected, I'm going to click on the chain symbol and then attach the player. And let's just move him somewhere in there so we see what's going on. Now with that, I want to give the player a script. And the script is going to go on the player node 2D, not on the image itself. The reason for that is later on, this node is going to get a whole bunch more children, and we want to move all of them together. For that, we have to move only the parent node, and since we apply the same transform to all of the children, we are moving all of them if we move the parent, which means the player is going to get a script. Once again, we get the dialog to create a new script, and the one thing I should have mentioned earlier, when you click on template, you either have default, and this one includes the ready function and process, whereas if you have empty, it doesn't include anything except the extend statement for the inheritance. I'm going to go with empty because I like to start clean, but you can choose whatever you want. On top of that, for the path, I want to save the script, so player.gd, in the same folder where I have the scene for the player, which I already have. So I can click on open and create. There we go. Now the player has a script. To check for input, once again, we will need the process function. And first of all in there, I want to get the input. And this I can do in a couple of different ways. Although there's one method that is the most succinct and the easiest to use. Let's have a look at input, because in there, if I scroll all the way up, we have a whole bunch of methods that we can use. And let me extend this window a bit so we can see things better. The method that is going to be most useful for us is called getVector. If I click on that, we get a bit more detail. This method is designed for top-down movement. Basically, what it wants is 4 different actions. One for negative x, or left, then positive x, so right. After that, negative y and positive y, which would be up and down. We could also add a dead zone, but we don't need to, so I'm going to ignore it. Once we have these 4 actions, Godot is going to return a vector, and this vector is going to give us the movement. For example, if the user only pressed the negative x action, we will get a vector that points at -1 and 0. So we are just going to the left, no up or down. If you just read these things on your own, I think especially at this stage, this is probably a bit confusing. And when you get started with coding, reading documentation can be a bit difficult. But if you have a bit of practice, all of this should become quite easy to understand. But, well, it does take some time to get used to it. Anyway though, I want to minimize this window and work inside of the player. To get the input, I first of all want to create a new variable. Let's call it var direction. And this direction I get with input and then dot get underscore vector. That is the method we just looked at. This one, and now we have to go through the different actions for the 4 directions. We have to start with negative x, which is a fancy way of saying left. Then we need positive x, which is just right. Then we need negative y, which is up. And finally, we needed positive y, which is down. Once we have all of those, Godot stops complaining, and we are getting a vector. To make sure this is working, let's print what we are actually getting from direction. And before I run all of this inside of the level, I want to comment out the print statement, so we only see the output for the direction, and it's not going to get too confusing. Let's run all of this. And now by default, we get 0 and 0, because I'm not pressing anything. However, if I press the left key, or I press A, then we get -1, because this is now telling the game that we want to move in the left direction. I can also press up, or down, or right, or 2 keys combined. Then we get a slightly less pretty vector, but it certainly works. The same would also work with WASD. We get pretty much the same output. This is looking really good. Which means with all of that, we can get the input and then we just have to use it to move the player. To actually move the player then, we have to target the position. And once again, I think for this, it's easiest to have the inspector open because what we ultimately want to change is the position of the node 2D. And this we can target with the position, which by itself is going to be a vector. All we have to do is position plus equal the direction and then times some kind of speed. Let's say 200. On top of that, what I covered in the last part, do not forget delta whenever you move anything continuously. Now, once we have all of that, I can run the code again. And now we can move the player around. It's quite slow, but it definitely works. So I am quite happy with that. It might be a good idea to increase the speed to, let's say, 500. And now we can move much faster. This is feeling better. But this would be the basics of movement. Later on, we are going to change that to account for physics. But for now, this is working just fine. That being said, I do want to add one more thing though, because right now we are just able to move. The player wouldn't have any way to input a shooting mechanic. For that, I want to add a bit more code. Let's call it the laser shooting input. I want to check if the player is pressing the primary input. I need an if statement, and this is going to look very similar compared to what we have done inside of this print statement. I want to check the input and then is action pressed, which means inside of the player, I want to get the input and then is action. For this one, you could use either is action just pressed or is action pressed. Later on, we are going to have a timer to delay the laser shooting anyway, so the difference here is negligible. But the action I'm looking for is primary action. If that is the case, for now, I simply want to print, let's say, shoot laser. And now I can run the game again. Now, if I click with my mouse button, I get shoot laser, or if I press space, we're also getting shoot laser. So this is working just fine. And that is covering all of the basics of keyboard input. All we have to do now is do an exercise and then we are done. I want you guys to create another action in the input map and call it secondary action. The associated keys are control, left control to be more specific, but it doesn't really matter, and also the right mouse button. If that action is triggered, print shoot grenade, and all of the code should be inside of the player right below the laser. Pause the video now and try to figure this one out. First of all, I have to update the input map. This I'm doing inside of project, input map. I want to add another action. I call this one secondary action. Now that I have the action, I have to add a couple of keys. I want to add control, so I just click control on the keyboard. Besides that, I'm going to click on the plus again, and I can click left mouse button in the field and then select right mouse button. This is the one we're looking for. That is going to update the input map, so now I can close it. After that, I can reopen the player code, and now we need to do something that is pretty similar to this. I want to add an if statement, and if input is action pressed, I am looking for the secondary action. If that is the case, I want to print shoot grenade. The specifics of what I print really don't matter. We're going to change this later on quite a bit anyway, but for now, this should be all we need. Let's try. And if I right click, we get shoot grenade. If I press on control, we also get shoot grenade. If I press space, we still get shoot laser, and we can also still move around. So all of this is coming together quite nicely. Perfect.